Welcome to Scientist Warning TV, and today, which will probably be the last interview I do in 2020, which has been quite a tumultuous year for most of us, I'm very pleased to have with me Professor Bill McGuire from UCL. Bill is an academic, an activist, a broadcaster, blogger, a writer of popular science, and then most recently he's ventured off into fiction, and we'll be talking a little bit about his novel Skyseed later on today. So Bill, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, so I've spoken with a number of scientists over the past few months, and one of the things that we find interesting and that our viewers find interesting is something about these sort of personal histories of the scientists, and particularly those like you who do speak up on the climate and ecological emergency, and what it is that prompted you to go beyond what might be seen as the conventional academic remit and to just use your voice and speak out.
Well, I followed quite a windy road, really, because I started off as a volcanologist, monitoring volcanoes, trying to figure out how they erupt and why they erupt. And then I moved on to looking at the relationship between volcanoes and climate, and that drew me into climate change, because we know, looking back in time, that there's a very close relationship between volcanic eruptions and climate. So looking more at a period when the climate's changing dramatically seemed the right way to go for me. And a lot of my research more recently has been looking at the relationship between geological hazards and climate, and it looked as if things were going to get quite bad in that sort of area. And so, I thought, well, climate change is a big thing. We're causing it. I can't resist the pull, really, of getting involved with this. And it's not good enough just to talk about it or to give scientific papers. You need to get out there and get involved at this stage, I think, because we're teetering on the edge of catastrophic climate breakdown.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, as a former academic who quit my job as a pro vice chancellor, for similar kinds of reasons, because I couldn't continue watching things getting worse and just doing absolutely nothing. So yes, so I totally empathise with that. But it's interesting because things are, it seems, getting worse. And there are a number of things that we can touch on, but I mean, one of the points that is sometimes made by scientists, that there's a discrepancy between what scientists will say in public, how far they're prepared to go, and then what they privately say, with the idea being that in private and off the record, then they will talk candidly about things being really, really quite bad. And I just wondered if you could say something about your personal experiences of that. I mean, does that stack up? Does that happen?
I completely agree. I mean, I talk to people, to climate scientists, to people who work in the whole general area of climate change and global heating, and they will, many of them at any rate, most of them probably will say one thing in private, which is always a lot more pessimistic than what they say in public, and it's frustrating because obviously the seriousness of climate breakdown and the public's perception of it is dependent upon what they hear scientists saying. And if scientists are playing it down, either intentionally or not, then that means that the response of the public to the emergency is not going to be commensurate with what it should be. So it's absolutely critical that climate scientists learn to put their head above the parapet, forget about being worried about what their colleagues will say about peer reviews or whatever. Just get out there and say what you think is really happening and how bad it's going to get. Because so the sugarcoating the pill isn't going to do any good at all in the long run.
I agree. And I mean, I was reminded of a quote by Stephen Schneider, who, a scientist who is no longer with us, for whom I have great respect. And I believe he was a mentor to Michael Mann, who similarly I have great respect for. And I'm just going to read out the quote from, or part of the quote from Stephen Snyder. Anyway, he talks about the double ethical bind, whereby scientists frequently find themselves in situations where they're torn between trying to tell the truth, but also being effective. And of course, being effective means that you have to engage the media and you have to give them a story. And then I guess it's a question about how far they should actually go. And I see this playing out frequently in terms of the things that scientists will say. So, for example, Michael Mann and Catherine Hayhoe are brilliant examples of excellent communicators. And in looking at the way they communicate, then it's often a case of, yes, we're making progress. So that's the positive bit. And then the negative piece always comes, which is, but we're not doing enough. We're not moving quickly enough. And as you say, I think clearly the public has to have confidence in scientists in terms of the integrity of what they're saying, but equally there's a perception also that being too alarmist can actually switch people off and deactivate them. So I just wondered if you have any reflections on that. When is alarmism too much? There's telling the truth, and the truth is alarming. So how do we tread that fine line between being truthful and telling it as it is, and it is bad, and then not scaring the hell out of the public?
Well, it's difficult with a climate that's breaking down rapidly not to scare the hell out of the public. I mean, you either tell the truth, which is that things are bad and are going to get worse, and we really need to act incredibly quickly, or you sugarcoat the pill and you tell something that's not true. If something is alarming, which this is, then you have to tell that. I mean, an alarm is raising an alarm is supposed to be for warning people. That's what we're doing, raising the alarm. But you only do that by giving people an idea of how bad things are going to be. If they are bad, then they need to know they're bad. I mean, in the Second World War, when Britain was fighting on its own, people knew things were very bad. They weren't told, "Oh, it's not too bad, don't worry about it." I don't think we can go down that route.
Yeah, I agree. And having in the past couple of years been on a very steep learning curve in terms of my understanding what is actually going on and how bad it is. It's terrifying. And I mean, the media, increasingly we find that the BBC, for example, are reporting more authentically about what's actually happening. But then some of the broadcasters are not, and it infuriates me, and I'm sure other people too, that some of the broadcasters and newsreaders and even the weather people will talk about these incredibly intense heat spells that we have, and as if it's a good thing. It's just not. It's just not. So yes, that's very frustrating. I wanted to mention also, in respect of the scientists who are reticent to speak up, which I think frustrates those scientists who do speak up. But an article published very recently by Naomi Oreskes and some of her colleagues in Environment Research Letters, where they've actually done a piece of really, really useful research with participants from the US and from Germany. And these are citizens, members of the public, and scientists themselves. And the article shows that there's a perception engagement gap, in that the public actually want scientists to speak up and to advocate on policy, and they expect that. And the scientists also similarly feel that they should be doing that. But of course, there's a gap. There's a gap between their own understanding what they should be doing and what they're actually doing. And it's interesting because it speaks to that problem of reticence and the barriers to scientists speaking up. In your experience, what do you see as being the sorts of barriers that scientists experience, and what can we do to encourage them to fulfill what the research shows is now their public obligations?
Well, in terms of climate science research, there's a big issue over consensus. People don't like to be outside the consensus, which means that findings, climate change findings, research, etc., tend to sort of focus around the central point. They tend to be relatively conservative. And there are great examples in the IPCC reports, because they still talk of a worst case sea level rise, for example, of around about 1 meter, or a little bit more maybe by the end of the century. There have been many peer-reviewed papers published that talk of 2 meters and more. And they are just not included in the report because it's a consensus report. And this is clear right through the climate scientists, that scientists tend to congregate around a consensus, and they are scared, I think, to show themselves out on a limb. They're scared of their peers and what they will say. They're scared of maybe not being able to get research grants as easily. And all these things sort of contribute towards that. And it's not easy to think of what a solution might be. I mean, scientists have always been a little bit like this. I mean, you can go back to the development of the atomic bomb, and the prevailing attitude was, well, it's not our responsibility. The morals of it are nothing to do with us. We are just doing the science. And there's still too much of that in climate science. We do the science. These are our findings. That's it. We stop there, even if we've got kids, which is rather strange.
Yes, and it does seem to be the climate scientists in particular, I think, who've become a bit of in a sense, a lightning rod for this particular kind of issue. Yes. So I think one of the comments that I've certainly heard some scientists say is that for them to go beyond what they see as the bounds of their role, and to actually talk about policy and advocacy and so forth, would compromise their objectivity, which is interesting. And the research that I've just referred to suggested that the public perception is that, well, actually, yes, if a scientist does come off the fence and advocates for one policy as opposed to another, then they are seen as being less objective. But the really interesting point is that they were still seen as being trusted. And trust really is the bottom line here, because I think it's fair to say that the public does trust scientists. It does trust, we do trust the science. So I would hope that an article like that would get some attention, some publicity, and and would start to reassure scientists that if the public trusts them, we're certainly not going to trust the politicians. Who else does the public turn to?
Well, it has to be. I mean, the scientists are there. They're in the front line. They can't really get out of it. And you're absolutely right. They, in terms of the science, they need to be completely objective. But that doesn't then feed into the policy and the implications of the science. That doesn't have to be objective. I mean, climate breakdown and global heating has gone way beyond an objective issue now, because everybody's under threat, including the climate scientists, including their families, their descendants. So, you can't be objective in the face of those sorts of things. Great, be objective in the science, then get out there and start telling people what the truth is about the science and how bad things are going to get. But also, make sure there's a message that we can still sort this out. It's not, we're not completely doomed yet. We can act. If we act fast enough, then we will begin to bring things under control.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important that message of, yes, things are really bad, is balanced with, and this is what we can do about it. Because I know that, I'm sure you're aware too, that there's a lot of criticism of people who seem to have given up and who are labelled with, sort of rather pejorative term as doomers. They're people who feel that it's so bad that there is actually nothing that can be done. And I think it's really important that, as you say, that the message is that, yes, there are things that we can do, and here's some examples. But going back to the point about telling the truth, I mean, one thing that frustrates me intensely, and it must frustrate you and others as well, is the gap between the pledges. And we saw on Saturday, I tuned into the entire session of pledges from the world's leaders. It sounded fairly impressive, but of course the pledge is just that. It doesn't necessarily have any teeth. And so what we've got, the Climate Action Tracker report recently showing that if we get all our ducks in a row and if we do X, Y, and Z, then we can limit warming to 2.1 degrees or thereabouts by 2100. That sounds good. And then we have the production gap report, which shows a rather different picture. And so there's this gap between the pledges and what people would like to do and would like to think that is going to be done. And then the reality, which is the fossil fuels are still pulling up the oil, and still, we still have plans for the coal mine in Cumbria, which is just a national disgrace. And there's a reality there that's not being addressed, I feel. It's all very well talking about pledges, but actually we have to simultaneously talk about the reality, and that does not seem to be addressed. So how do we tell the story around that?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, pledges, as you say, are completely meaningless. And at the very least, we need each country to develop a pathway that shows how they're going to get there. And even then, we're looking at pledges that are, generally speaking, tailored towards net zero emissions in mid-century, which is almost certainly too late to prevent catastrophic climate change. I'm a little bit more optimistic in this area than I was, because I see changes occurring, particularly in terms of coal and fossil fuels in general, that suggest that over the next few years we might see a very big drop in production. I mean, there was a piece of news yesterday. I used to work a lot with the insurance and reinsurance industries, because obviously they have a role in terms of natural hazards and their impacts. They also insure facilities, coal mines, oil platforms, all these sorts of things. And many of these insurance companies now are pulling out of insuring any coal facilities. And Lloyd's of London announced just a couple of days ago that its agents would no longer fund anything to do with coal, pretty much. So, that's a small piece of news, but it can have a huge impact. Because if you're opening a coal mine, or if you're developing a coal mine or anything like that, it has to be insured. Otherwise, you're liable to go bankrupt. So there are things like that, and which are small but capable of having a massive impact. So I'm a little bit hopeful that we might, over the next few years, see huge changes in the energy landscape. Could be wishful thinking, but I know I'm not normally known as an optimist. So for me,
oh well, that's good. That's good if you feel that things are looking a little better, and if you're not normally known as an optimist, then that bodes well. There is a sense, I think, in which more and more people are aware, and that's thanks to the work of the scientists who speak up, like yourself, and activist groups like Sunrise and Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, and more and more people. So, for example, I know I can walk up and down my street, and people know, they know that there's a climate and ecological emergency. They don't know what to do about it, which is another problem, but they know that it exists. But going back to the point about just how bad things are, and things have been getting progressively worse. And I think one of the most potent examples of a frustrated scientist that I've heard was Kevin Anderson talking at a COP a few years ago. And his frustration was palpable. He sat there and he said, we've been here for 26 years and nothing has changed. And young Greta's saying exactly the same thing, with her steely determination. And then, and Hugh Hunt, for example, the engineering department here in Cambridge, and saying, well, we're still accelerating towards the brick wall, but we're not going quite as fast, but we're still heading, we haven't put our feet on, haven't put our foot on the brake. And I mention Hugh because he's an advocate of geoengineering practices, and for example, something which sounds really alarming, so refreezing the Arctic, and which isn't Hugh is not to disparage him in any sense at all. He's an excellent researcher, and similarly Sean Fitzgerald of the Centre for Climate Repair in Cambridge, also an engineer and and highly respected academic. But geoengineering is something, and we'll come to that when we talk about your book. But it sounds as if it's tinkering with science, with Earth systems that we don't fully understand. And I think even the best scientists would say that we don't fully understand all of the Earth systems, and therefore to take a chance and to intervene is quite risky. But scientists and researchers like Hugh Hunt, for example, say, well, and I sort of quote him, it's better than doing nothing. And you can see the point, because the Arctic is heating 3 times faster than some other parts of the planet. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about why the Arctic is crucial, and how you weigh up the pros and cons of, do we try and intervene in the case of the Arctic, and how we would then balance that against the downside of the risks, how you quantify the risks of that kind of intervention in the Arctic.
Yeah, I mean, both the Arctic and the Antarctic are critical areas, because that's where most of the world's ice is locked up. And on a warmer planet, that ice will convert to water, which will raise sea level rise dramatically. I mean, if all the ice melted on the planet, we'd be looking at maybe 70 meters of sea level rise, which would bring the sea right into near Derby, where I live, right in the centre of Britain.
Well, and Cambridge becomes a seaside resort.
Yes, you'd be underwater long before. So they're both critical areas. But I mean, one of the things that they do while they exist is the Greenland ice sheet and the Arctic sea ice and Antarctica is they reflect an enormous amount of heat back into space. So as they melt, as white ice is replaced with dark water, so more heat is absorbed, and that has a global impact then on the whole planet. But messing about with what's called the albedo, the reflectivity of the Arctic sounds like a very, very scary thing to do. If you get it right, then it might help to cool things down as more sunlight's reflected back into space. If you get it wrong, and you go the other way and you have a much bigger ice sheet, then we might have ice house Earth to worry about rather than hot house Earth. It is, we just don't understand the weather system and all its feedbacks and interactions. It's unbelievably complex. I'm not a meteorologist or a climate scientist in that sense, but I know that these things are incredibly difficult to predict if you start fiddling about with them. And geoengineering in general has a number of issues. First of all, it's regarded by many people as a sort of final backstop. So, we can't get emissions down. We've always got geoengineering, and that detracts from people who want to get emissions down as quickly as possible. And I tend to use the analogy, if we're fighting to save a city and our families in the city, and we're fighting in the last line of defense, we will fight harder than if we're in the second line of defense. And it's quite clear that governments are paying attention to geoengineering and its possibilities, even the UK government. So, they're thinking in the backs of their minds, oh, well, if we don't get emissions down quickly enough, we can still resort to this. And that's dangerous in its own right. And then, and then just adopting any geoengineering solution, in inverted commas, at a global scale is massively expensive. It potentially is devastating in terms of environments and ecologies. So it has its own issues there. One of the other popular geoengineering ideas is to pump tens of millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to mimic a volcano. Big volcanic eruptions cool the planet. But I know from my career in volcanology that big eruptions also bring about massive reductions in crop yields, global harvest failure, worldwide famine as well because of the cooling. So, I don't think you can get away with doing this sort of thing without ramifications for at least some parts of the world. And who decides which parts of the world are going to have the negative impacts to allow everybody else to get the positives?
Exactly. And just going back to that conversation that Sean Fitzgerald took part in, and the point where I did agree with him was, yes, we need more research. We clearly can't just launch into some kind of geoengineering at the moment, although there are lots of groups researching it. But research takes time, and whilst we are doing research on that, on geoengineering as a possible, last minute get out of it option, things are still getting worse. And so for me, there's another sense in which, geoengineering is not just, a last resort and a very high stakes and very highly risky one, but it's potentially feeding into delayism, because whilst we're putting our hopes and pinning our hopes on that as potentially offering us some viable solutions, then we're continuing with our unsustainable lifestyles at the moment and not actually tackling the problems that we should be tackling in the here and now, which is really just to get the emissions down. And as Catherine Hayhoe put it in a recent commentary, just leave the fossil fuels in the ground. That's just one thing that we should be doing. So geoengineering, I would agree, high risk, deeply problematic, and again, possibly fueling the kinds of delayist tactics that politicians would love, and sort of not actually grappling with the real issues, which is that we have got to do something really radical about the carbon emissions in the here and now.
It's not a coincidence that fossil fuel companies are enormously in favour of geoengineering, because they see it as a means whereby they can continue to pump out more carbon dioxide, provided there is a mechanism that can suck that carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere again, or that can compensate for the heating. That isn't a surprise. It's
astonishing that the fossil fuel companies are through branding and trying to reposition themselves as the good guys in all of this. And they're the ones who are going to do the carbon capture. And it astonishes me also that so many, because geologists, of course, have vested interests in because a lot of their work is funded by fossil fuel companies, and some universities in the UK, which I probably shouldn't mention, are still putting on courses in petroleum engineering and offering these to incoming students. It's absolutely shocking. And I've remembered that, of course, one of the things you're known for is resigning publicly from the Geological Society.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which
I was, I mean, I've been in the Geological Society ever since I graduated. I was the chairman of the Volcanic Studies group there. I organised lots of meetings. I was on the council. But last year, I think it was last year or the year before, I don't know, the last year's gone rather strangely. I thought I can't carry on doing this. They're being sponsored still by BP, the Shell. They've got very strong involvement with the fossil fuel companies in general. And so I wrote a letter saying, there doesn't seem to be any sign of you pulling out from these relationships, and you can't carry on with them in this day and age, knowing what we know. So I felt I had to resign, which I did.
Yes, which is an honourable gesture. You probably are aware that the 500 scientists declare that there is no climate emergency was signed by a number of members of the Geological Society, which just speaks to the point you've made. These vested interests that some scientists clearly have. Yes. Okay. So, I mean, so in terms of talking about geoengineering being scientifically, unproven, high stakes, very risky, uncosted, it's hard to quantify the cost. But I think there are also issues around the governance framework for doing something like that, the ethical framework too. I mean, who are we as one species on the planet to assert our rights to try to interfere with it? And I just wondered if you've thought about the ethical minefield that would be a geoengineering intervention. I mean, how would we even go about broaching something like that?
Well, it's incredibly difficult. I don't think people have really thought very much about it. And in fact, I tend to think that getting an agreement to geoengineer the planet would be just as difficult as getting an agreement to cut emissions as the science demands. So, I don't think that gets us that much further in terms of international consensus. And then, what if we have a huge conference and all the countries vote on it, and 2/3 of them say yes and a third say no, and the third that say no are the ones that are going to suffer as a result? I mean, what do we go ahead then? I mean, it's not just a general ethical issue of whether or not we should interfere in our planetary system. It's about who has the right to decide to do so on behalf of everyone on the planet, when many of those people don't want to go ahead with this. It's a huge issue.
It's massive, and because there are unforeseen consequences too, in that research papers are published which talk about some of these techniques, and you perhaps know that some years ago, ocean pasture restoration, which has a which is based in science. I believe it was John Martin from NASA who first investigated that as a possible means of carbon sequestration, and did an experiment which then worked. But ideas like that can be tainted if they're taken forward, or people try to progress them and do so without having the proper without being properly authorized, without being properly monitored, and so forth. And I think those kinds of risks are going to exist for any of these kinds of approaches. In the wrong hands, then they could be really quite catastrophic. So how on earth do you regulate something like that? So yes, all sorts of unforeseen, unintended, and highly undesirable consequences. And it's just I have your book here, which is quite amazing, and it actually talks at great length about this. But I just wanted to say that when you hear about scientists are usually seen as being rational and hard-nosed and so forth, and not necessarily particularly well versed in literature and so on. But this is an exception, because it's really incredibly well written. I have to I read the first few pages. If you haven't read this book, you will be gripped, because there's this incredibly gory death which is described in detail. And I think, crikey, because clearly what happens in the context of volcanoes and so forth, and then you can actually imagine what happens to the individual. But yes, it's an excellent book. And I just want to ask you, because you do a blog, you're known as a blogger, you've written lots of papers, and you give lots of presentations and interviews and so on. So what made you decide to write a book? to talk about geoengineering? I mean, what was your motivation in doing that?
Well, again, I sort of followed a pathway from writing nature papers to writing popular science books, to writing short stories, fictional short stories. And in fact, before Skyseed, I published with Andrew Sims of the New Weather Institute. I published a book of modern folk tales last year, which has short stories from all sorts of people, artists, musicians, business people, which have morals to them which are relevant to today and relevant to particularly the climate crisis. So, having gone all the way through up to the short stories, I thought I might as well take it one step further. And in fact, my agent at Curtis Brown, she'd read some of my short stories and thought that one of them in particular, called The Fix, could be upgraded to a novel, if you like. And so that's what I did. And that was written last year and published in September.
Yeah, great. I'm interested in the writing process here, but for you as a scientist and then writing short stories, I can see a novel is a different beast because because you have to think about character development and all of that kind of thing. What was the hardest part for you in writing the novel?
I'm not really sure that I found it particularly hard. I'm not boasting or
That's
anything.
inspiring.
I found it I found it enjoyable rather than hard, to be honest. And I enjoyed developing the characters, and I drew on a lot of bits and pieces of people I knew and incidents that I'd been involved with or knew about. But I don't particularly think I found any of it harder than any other part. I just had a really good time writing it, which may be unusual. Speaking to some writers who come up with a fantastic product, but find it a real struggle along the way. Whereas I had a great time.
That's good to hear. I think it's accessible to the ordinary person. It's accessible to anyone who might want to read about geoengineering, who might be interested in the climate crisis and what our options might be. And for me, it's extremely informative because it gives people food for thought, so that when they hear a politician or someone talking about the kinds of tinkering that we might do with the planet, I mean, hopefully someone who's read the book will think, well, hang on a second, is that wise? Should we really be doing that? Yes. And so, and what for you is the key message for the book? I mean, what, for someone reading the book, what's the one thing that you'd really want them to kind of take away?
Well, first of all, it's a thriller. So the first thing I'd like them to take away is, wow, that was a really good read. I mean, that you don't write a novel only to sort of send a message to people. So if you just read it and it's a fantastic read and you love it, then that's good enough for me. But also, obviously, it has messages in there. One of the messages, the key message, is really that we need to think very, very carefully before we follow a route involving messing about the climate, when we've already got ourselves into a serious mess over the last couple of centuries with what we've done. So it's there. You can see that message is in there clearly. It's be careful what you wish for, I think, in terms of using geoengineering to bring temperatures down.
Yeah, and also I feel, I'm very fond of saying there's no such thing as a free lunch. There are no quick ways out of this, and I feel that a really important message, from your book, but just generally for people, is that it's going to be hard work, and the sooner we really get on with it and accept that this is the biggest challenge. It is an existential crisis. It's the biggest challenge we'll ever face. There are no easy ways out. That swapping your diesel or petrol engine vehicle for an EV is not going to do it. Underfloor heating, becoming a vegan, these will help, but in and of themselves they're not sufficient. We need a real massive overhaul, system overhaul, the kind of things that Julia Steenberger, who I interviewed some months ago, it's a complete rejigging of the entire economic system. It's tweaking is simply not going to do it. And geoengineering really, from what you say, from what the scientists are saying, is incredibly high stakes, and it shouldn't be our first port of call, when there are other things that we should be doing first.
Well, we know from past events, like after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States transformed their economy completely within a year, building ships and bombers and making bullets instead of nails and this sort of. It can be done. It has been done before. Rapid transitions in all sorts of areas are possible. And if we really wanted to slash emissions, we could do it within a year or two. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but it's possible if that was our goal. But our goal seems to be GDP, more money, more profits, etc. As long as that's the goal of most countries, well, all countries and all governments, then we're not going to be able to do it. It needs a complete change of thinking in terms of what we need to be focusing on. But it's possible and it's doable, definitely.
Well, I agree. And that's a good, that's a positive note to end on. But yes, it's a massive challenge, but yes, it's doable. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed it.